In this blend file, I have these two models that I got off of polyhaven.com, and you can grab them there for free. They have free assets like HDRIs, textures, and models like 3D scans like these. So for this project, I wanted to use an apple and an orange, but the closest thing they had on the site was this lime. So we'll just start with turning this into an orange. I'll first select both of these and go to Object, set Origin to Geometry, just so the origin is nice and centered around the models. And then I'll hide that apple and select this. I'll hit Shift A and add a lattice. And then zoom out a bit, come into the lattice settings. Actually, I'll just scale this down so that it's enclosing our model nicely. Then I'll go to the top view, make sure it's the same. And that will do. And then in the lattice settings, I will adjust some of these settings just so I can have like some resolution to tweak. So I'll just come here and in this axis, I'll set that to 5. And then these other axes, I'll set something like 7. I'll then select this model, come into the modifiers and add a lattice, and then set the lattice that we created right there. So now if you select the lattice and go into edit mode, you'll notice if you tweak the lattice, it also tweaks the model within that lattice. So what I want to do with this is just kind of tweak this to make it a bit more spherical, like an orange. So I'll select this, make sure the pivot point is set to median point, and then scale this outward, something like that. Then I'll select this and select these, and then hit S to scale, and then Shift Z so that it omits the Z axis. And that just allows me to scale these out just like that. And I'll be careful not to do it too much because it kind of starts warping the textures and it looks weird. So I'll just do something like that. Something like that. So already that's looking kind of nice. I will go back into edit mode and come to these top vertices. Then I'll make sure to select these. I'll select first this one so I can move it down some. Then I'll select these. Then move these up. Something like that. You can spend all the time you need to just make sure that looks to your liking. But this is good enough for me. So I'll just select that model and then come here and apply that modifier. So you can now delete that lattice. And now we have, this to me looks more like an orange. But the last thing I'll do to just complete that is I will come into the shading tab because I just want this to look a bit more ripe. I'll go into Object. And then what I want to do is tweak this texture before it feeds into the base color in the principled shader. And I'll do that using the color ramp. So when you plug that in, you'll see it turns that into grayscale. But the beautiful thing about this is you can take these and start plugging in whatever colors you want right here. So I'll turn this into B-spline because I find the gradient on B-spline is just a lot more forgiving. And then I will add a few nodes in there and set these colors to oranges and yellows and reds. So something like this. Something like that. Something like that and that. Then you can come in here and start sliding these around until everything looks to your liking. So something like that I like. And just like that, you've converted your piece of lime into an orange. The last thing I'll do to just complete this is I'm going to unhide that apple and then select it, go into edit mode. And what I want to do is just take this stick that's sticking out here and duplicate it and plug one on top of the orange. So I'll just deselect all these. Just like that. Deselect these. And then I'll hit Shift D and then P, separate selection. I'm just going to take that, move it aside, do a bit more deleting. I'll select these. And then just delete those vertices. I'm then going to take this, make sure it's nicely aligned, and just stick it on top of the orange. Another thing I'm going to do here, when I join these two, I'll select the stick, select the orange, hit Ctrl J so that they're joined. And then I'll just move in here and make sure, because right now if I hover over the orange and select it, it doesn't select the stick. And that's going to be a bit inconvenient for what we're going to do next. So what I want to do is just select this vertex from the stick, one from the orange, then just hit F so that they are connected. So now if I deselect everything and then I just hover over the orange and hit L, it selects everything. And that's just going to be handy for what we'll do next. So with that done, we are done with the orange. So that just kind of gives you an idea of what to do when life gives you lemons. So with that done, the next thing I want to do is combine these two objects into the same object. And then we're going to use the shape keys and modifiers to create that wobble, nice looking transition effect. So I'll go into the front and then I'll just make sure they overlap just like that. And then I will join these two objects into the same object. With that done, I'm going to add a shape key. So the basis just remembers the original shape of the object. And then I'll add another shape key so that this is the slider we'll now use to transition between the two, the orange and the apple. So inside edit mode, I'll just make sure that in the original one, so when I select the basis and go into edit mode, I'll make sure that the orange isn't visible. So I'll just scale that down, something like that, so that it's enclosed within the orange. And then I'll select the other shape key and then go into edit mode. And then I'm now going to scale this up so that it's roughly the size of the apple. And then I'll invert my selection and then scale the apple down so that it's enclosed within the orange. And now if you go into object mode and slide this shape key around, at 0 it's an apple and at 1 it's an orange. So this is what we'll be using to just create that sudden transition between the two shapes. And then in the modifiers now we'll be using the displace modifier to make that transition look just a lot more cooler. I'm now going to select our object, and inside the modifiers I'll add a displace modifier and go into the textures and add a clouds texture. And then just scale this way down. I'll go back into the modifiers and scale the strength way down to something like that. And the idea here is as that transition happens, I want to kind of give this feeling that that energy is kind of still trapped inside that object as it transitions between the apple and the orange. So I'll go back into the textures and scale this down so that it's a bit more detailed. And I think that just looks more interesting. But this is completely up to you. You have the freedom to play around and tweak it and see what you can come up with. So I like that. And as you can see back in the shape keys, you can still transition between the two and still maintain that texture, that displacement in the model. So to give this displacement some life, I'm going to select the object, Shift S, cursor to selected, and add an empty. And then I'm going to animate this empty. So in the animations tab, I will add a keyframe in the Z rotation. And then in the graph editor, so that's in the graph editor, with the empty selected, let's see, this looks a bit too small. With the empty selected, I'll come into the modifiers and add a generator. And if you play that, you'll see that it's rotating in the Z axis. And to make that a bit slower, I'll turn this value way down to something like that. And then back in the modifiers, I'll select the object, and in the modifiers tab, the coordinates of the texture, I'll set this to object, and then set the object to this empty that we just created. So you'll see now that the texture rotates, the coordinates of the texture are pinned to the coordinates of the empty, and as it rotates that texture around. And this just kind of gives life and movement to the texture, and it animates, it just makes that the transition and that wobble look just a lot more cooler when that transition happens. So with all this set up, the only thing that's remaining is the animation. So the first thing I'll do here is select the apple, Shift S, set the cursor to the apple, and then I'm going to add an empty, and I will add a sphere and scale it all the way down. And then what I'll do is I'll select the apple and the empty that controls the texture, and that final empty that we selected, I'll select that last, and then hit Control P, and then parent the apple and that other empty to this last empty. So if I select that now and rotate this around, we'll see what that does. And if I do that while the timeline is playing, I can rotate that last empty, which moves everything in the scene while still maintaining all that we've set up beneath that still intact. So with that empty selected, I will place a keyframe in its X, Y, and Z rotation, and then go into the animation workspace. And then here, with these selected, let's say with the X rotation selected, I will add in the animation modifiers, I will add a generator and play that and see what that does. So that's way too fast. So I'll scale that down to something like that. And then I will copy this modifier and in the Y rotation, paste that in there. And in the Z rotation, I will also place that in there so that we have our object rotating nicely. So we'll begin by creating that transition of the two fruits between the apple and the orange. And that transition happens just across one frame. It's instantaneous. And then we'll use the displacement texture to kind of dissipate that energy, create the illusion of the dissipation of energy across a number of frames. So we'll start by going into the keyframes. And then at frame 1, I'm going to set a keyframe in the value right there, as it's an apple. So I want 50 frames of the apple and then 50 frames of the orange, and then have that flipping back and forth. So at frame 49, I will set a keyframe there, and then at frame 50, I'm going to turn this all the way up to 1 and set a keyframe there, and then go all the way to frame 99, and then set another keyframe there. So you'll see from frame 1 to frame 49, it's an apple, and then it flips to the orange, and then at frame 99, what we're going to do here is add a modifier, the cycles modifier, and what this does is it just flips back from your last keyframe back to the first one, and it just creates that cycle, flipping back and forth infinitely. But you have some settings here that you can use to control how far you want that to go, which is really cool. So that's working, but it doesn't yet look really, really cool. So we'll go into the modifier tab and work here to now get that wobble to look really nice. So I'll go here, and at frame 1, I want this to be at something like that. I'll set a keyframe right there, and then go all the way to frame 49, just like we did before. Set that to 0, place a keyframe there, and then again at that transition, flip this back up to something like that. Place a keyframe there, then go all the way again to frame 99, and then turn that back to 0 and place a keyframe. So you'll see what that looks like. But then we want to now get into the curves here and tweak it and get it to look really nice. So I'll select the value of the strength. This is where the keyframes we've created, and I'll zoom in so that I can see it much better. And then, we want, because that transition is instantaneous, we want to kind of get this displacement to follow that, to kind of just merge those two. So what I'll do is shape these keyframes right here, just like that. You want that as the transition happens, you want the slope to be steep, and then turn that gradually all the way down. And then as that transition happens again, you want that slope to be steep, just like that. And then I'll maybe turn this up so that it matches that previous one. And then we can come here again, set that cycles modifier so that that repeats over and over again, and it matches the previous ones that we set. So if we look at that, let's see how that looks like. It goes, and then boom, and then boom, and then boom. So that looks really, really cool. It kind of makes that instantaneous transition look a lot more interesting, and then it seems like that energy is dissipated across frames and then happens again, which I think just looks really, really cool. And then the other thing that I did in that previous animation to push this even one step further, I went into the textures and added some emission to kind of have some light emitting from the models as that transition is happening. So to do that, I'll just come here into the materials, say select the apple, and I will just add some space here so that I can work within one workspace. Set that to the shader editor. And then what I did was, let's shape this a bit. I'll plug this into the emission of the principal shader. And that looks really cool. I'll turn this down to something like that. And something else you can do is add a color ramp. No, not a color ramp, RGB curves, and then just tweak this right before it feeds into the color of the emission. And then you can tweak that until you have something that you like. So that, I think, is cool. Actually, I think I might just something like that. Then the only thing remaining to do now is just animate the strength of this emission. So I'll come here and set a keyframe at like that, and then go all the way to frame 79. Actually, what I'll do here, because we see the apple from frame 1 to frame 49, and then it turns into the orange, and then we don't see it anymore. So what I'll do is I'll set a keyframe at frame 49 and turn that all the way back down to 0 and set a keyframe there. But then I'll also move this all the way to frame 99 and set another keyframe right there at 0, so that when we now cycle this, it'll pick this as our starting point again. And then I'll come back here, scale this down like that. And then shape this just like that. So if you watch that, the apple goes boom, all the way down, then it turns into an orange, and the apple back again. Wait, oh yeah, and then cycles. That's what I forgot. So if we play that. Now lastly, if you do the same thing to the material of the orange, you'll have something that looks like this. So that's it for this video. I hope you learned something from it. It was really fun to make. And if you do make something out of this, do tag me online. I'd really like to see them. And you can collect the intro for this tutorial, which is where this whole tutorial was born from on Maker's Place. And I will see you in the next one.